Well, this year represents one of the most unusual years in the political sphere as billions of citizens from over 60 countries, including, of course, South Africa, will take to the polls to express their views regarding who should lead them through the trying times that we are currently living in. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwane tabled his much-anticipated budget on Wednesday, and many, especially analysts and economists, were left unmoved, saying it provided quick fixes without any actual unrealistic intent and much needed directive, much like the SONA. Well, Khaya Sithole is an accountant, an academic and activist who writes and tweets on finance, economics and politics, and he joins us now live to share his views. Khaya, a very good evening to you. Look, welcome. Now, you say this budget speech was centered on political rhetoric, not reflective of our current reality. Please elaborate further.
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. So I think the reality of a budget that's delivered ahead of a general election is that it's always going to be a reluctant budget. And what makes it a reluctant budget is that if it coincides with the time in which difficult trade-offs are required, difficult decisions are required to be made, then the budget is unlikely to take that gamble. And the simple reason is that all the difficult decisions may then come with a particular political fallout. So if, for example, you engage in what is referred to as an austerity budget ahead of an election, then you run the risk of that being used against your party and your government as a basis for mobilizing people to vote in the alternative. So what you then see with budgets that get delivered ahead of an election is that they tend to go for the low-hanging fruit, the things that get us across the line, that get us through the electoral cycle without having to deal with the more difficult and long-term questions. And I think this week's budget reflected that in the sense that the minister, as far back as recently as October, kept telling us that we need to somehow cut spending, we need to balance the books. So obviously, there are essentially only a couple of ways in which public finances can be balanced. It's either you raise additional taxes or you cut the spending. And in this instance, he didn't raise the taxes and he also didn't want to cut the spending because luckily, fortuitously for the country, there's 150 billion rand that they found in a reserve account that they're then using to sort of give us the impression that something is being done. Unfortunately, in light of how much we owe and in light of how much we need to be able to cut, that 150 billion rand doesn't get us very far. It simply gets us through the 29 May cycle. And beyond that, we still have to deal with difficult questions.
Now, Kai, look, these quick fixes that were provided in the speech when entities like, of course, your PRASA and other much needed infrastructural development entities. I mean, Eskom is currently still in the doldrums, didn't get much money or lots of it anyway. So we're basically in a slow regress, worse than what we are currently experiencing with no short-term directive in sight.
And the tragedy of that is that at this stage, we are all fully aware of what the key problems are in relation to some of the big state enterprises. We are also fully aware that some of them are simply too important and too big to fail. So what loomed as the great ghost of this particular budget was the fact that nothing was said about Transnet. And Transnet is, of course, the one entity that, alongside Eskom, has the capacity to enable us to start moving forward in terms of economic momentum. Now, of course, when it comes to Eskom, we've heard that there is indeed an allocation of 254 billion rand that was committed to in previous budgets. But that only simply addresses the debt question at Eskom. It does not deal with the engineering question. And until the engineering questions are sorted and we can be able to be guaranteed some security of energy, we have a problem. The secondary issue is that, of course, Transnet cannot afford to be ignored. And I think in this budget, it largely was ignored. But the consequence of ignoring Transnet is that every other thing that you want to focus on, whether it's the investment in the social wage, whether it's investment in economic growth, it hinges on the fate of these two organizations. So these two organizations should dominate the budgets until we fix them. And in this week, they didn't do so.
Very quickly, Kai, look, it's been 4 years since the COVID pandemic, right? And yet it seems the important lessons have still not yet been learned and corrective measures are undertaken. Surely this cannot be the excuse, though.
Well, I think the irony of COVID is that the COVID pandemic gave us what we refer to as the trampoline effect. And what the trampoline effect is that you saw in the aftermath of the pandemic, then suddenly there was an opportunity to do things differently because you had learned that we actually can do things differently during a particular crisis moment. We saw the commodities boom that emerged in the immediate aftermath. And of course, if it's a boom and you cannot get it to the ports when it actually isn't much of a boom. So South Africa missed that opportunity to capitalize on that particular commodities boom, and it has now passed. And the reality here is that until we fix the underlying structural issues, whatever economic upside emerges in the near future, we simply will not be able to participate in it.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for that. That is Khaya Sithole, an accountant, academic and activist who writes and tweets on finance, economics as well as politics.